Welcome to the Pay Mentalist podcast. This is the spot for merchants, software execs, and payment sales pros who want to level up their commerce game. It's an absolute pleasure to be back with another episode packed with insights and expert advice in the payment processing ecosystem. Today we have the privilege of hosting a true titan in the world of payments, none other than the CRO of our very own company, Chris Henneman. Chris comes with a wealth of knowledge and expertise with over 20 years of payment experience under his belt. His illustrious career has seen him work closely with sponsor banks, payment processors, payment gateways, and ISOs and sales agents. He also has specialized experience in helping software companies craft integrated payment strategies that just don't add value through new lines of revenue, but also ensure control and ownership over their customer portfolios, which contribute to boosting enterprise value. What sets Chris apart is his ability to navigate the complex landscape of payment strategies, maximizing value, and safeguarding client interests. His knowledge and insights are sought after industry-wide, and we're lucky to have him here with us today. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thanks for having me. That's quite the intro. I appreciate it.
No problem. Well, to kick things off, Chris, let's just start. Just want to get your thoughts. How does a well-defined integrated payment strategy contribute to the maximization of a software company's enterprise value?
Well, again, thanks for having me. Super interested in a lot of the things that we're talking about. So in terms of, building out, all software companies, SaaS companies today are trying to build out as much value add as they can for their customers, right? They're trying to add as many products and services that contribute to the stickiness as well as give them the brand recognition that they're looking for. And the way we view this is simply that this is another thing that they can do to add to their stickiness. Again, they're adding value to their customers by providing an integrated experience with the payments relative to their software. And so from my perspective, again, it's just creating more of a well-rounded, completely comprehensive payment or business strategy relative to, again, the overall asset value of the business.
Okay. Can you describe the significance of control and ownership over the customer portfolio, especially in the context of the payment service contract and relationship?
Well, I think there's a lot of different options out there in payments in terms of what version of, the merchant experience that a payments company can own. There's a wide variety of, involvement levels that you can have. And so, depending on the operational expense that they want to shoulder, depending on the experience that they want their customers to have, whether they want to control that experience from a customer support side, from a sales side, whether they're confident in another person doing it. There's a lot of different things to consider when you're considering, what that picture looks like. And so I think the first step is really to identify, okay, what is it that, do we have the operational capacity that we want to absorb some of these responsibilities? Or are we more interested in just having kind of that product that we can have some involvement in where we own the customer contract, where it's on our brand and it's a brand we can build in conjunction with our core product, our core software, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, right. So let me ask you this. How can the lack of control and ownership affect the asset value of the portfolio when perhaps they're dealing with strategic buyers or investors?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A question we get a lot. When you're thinking about, referring business to a processor, which is, a lot of people do it. It's very common. I think some of the biggest payment processors out there today do a ton of that business. And in that circumstance, you are a referral source. You're going to get a check every month for a percentage of the revenue that is generated from the customers that you refer, but you don't have any real interest in how these customers are handled, how the pricing is controlled, what the interaction is like on the customer service side. And so when you think about asset value from an enterprise perspective, you are, rather than just being a line item on a P&L of referral revenue for payments, you're talking about it can be as much as contributing to your top line revenue, and can be a considerable boost to your, again, overall revenue, or it can just be a line item on a P&L. And so from my perspective, dealing with a lot of M&A and private equity companies, VC companies, they all care. I mean, obviously, if you can add to top line revenue, despite the fact that you have more costs, top line revenue is always a good thing. It's always something that they're looking for. Additionally, you're going to increase the value of your aggregate, package, if you will, to a potential buyer, because you just control so much of what is the customer's interaction with you.
Right. So maybe we just take a step back here, Chris. Can you define what does it actually mean to own the payment or customer portfolio from a payment processing perspective?
What does it mean? So from my perspective, again, there are a few different versions of this out in the industry, as we've kind of discussed in the past, in terms of just kind of, you can own the paper to some degree, but call it a wholesale sponsorship, where you are partnering with a bank, where you're given the credit policy, where you're adhering to strict standards. You don't have much say in terms of how it's handled. Retail, a retail sponsorship, you're just basically a sales arm for a larger entity. When you talk about asset value of the business, what is the difference between the two?
I think what we're trying to understand, Chris, is when we talk about, for example, ownership, if in the context of a software company, right? What does it mean that I own the customer portfolio? Like from, I guess, a technical perspective, from a value perspective, what does that mean?
So from a technical perspective, again, based on how many different variations, there can be different variations of that ownership, where it's kind of a surface level ownership, where the customer believes that they're doing business with you because your name is on the statements that they get or the communication that they get. Or there's as much as you owning a bin with the card brands, and having all of your customers within a designated unique bin with the card brands. And to me, when you talk about true ownership of the customer, again, if it's perceptional, yeah, you can have that pretty easily. But if you really want to, again, own and control the entire ecosystem relative to payments with the customer, that's where, getting your own bin, owning the customer, again, it's a registration with the card brands, it's a registration with a bank, and all of your customers are funneled in that bin that is then yours, as opposed to in some of the other scenarios where you have a shared bin, you're just grouped with a bunch of other people. It just doesn't have the same transferable value that you would in terms of in an M&A scenario where, someone wants to acquire, you have a dedicated bin that you can do, an assignment and acquisition to a different bin, and then increase the value of that strategic partner or strategic buyer. So I think again, it kind of depends. You can always have some version of ownership, again, whether it's just optically or whether it's actually tangibly. And I think that spectrum is kind of where, the customer, kind of the way we think about it, is needs to kind of decide where they want to fall and where they believe the value to be. But from our perspective, we've been, selling and I would say seeing a lot that, these private equity companies care that it's a dedicated bin and that it's a payment, it's a portfolio that you actually, in terms of from the card brand's perspective, you're responsible for and that you own.
Yeah. So naturally, I think every software company is obviously asking the question, how do I maximize fully the value of integrated payments, right? Not only from a revenue perspective, conversion, profitability, but they're also looking what can contribute to overall maximize our enterprise value. And so, the idea of owning and having asset value over the actual payment service contract and ownership of the portfolios is important. But I think the natural question now is, perhaps what disruptions or operational burdens or risks does a software company have to be aware of if they are to pursue a path of full ownership over their customer portfolio?
And actually owning a bin,
yeah.
So, that in and of itself, that's kind of why some of these other, I'm going to say disruptors have come out and kind of said, hey, we can, pay fax that will allow you to just kind of be a branded PayFac, so you're just a white labeled version of a PayFac, or you actually go to PayFac being payment facilitator. So you're actually going to a bank and getting your payment facilitator agreement and a license with that bank. There's a few different versions of that those have come out in order to kind of provide kind of a version of that bin ownership. Kind of a how would I describe it? A lesser version of it, but from an optic perspective, it kind of feels the same way. And so the way we think about it is that you can be a sub Payfac, you can have some sort of visibility, but you don't really have that true ownership. And so
Chris, let's delve into some specific payment models available in the marketplace for software companies as they're developing an integrated payment strategy. You have payment facilitation, you have Payfac-as-a-Service, you also have just referral partnership, and then you have the idea of actually registering as an ISO or an FSP to actually obtain your own BIN. And so what I'd like to do is just compare and contrast as it applies to control over the contract, the payment service contract, the ownership of the portfolio. With those models in mind, what achieves that? What limits that? That's what we'd like to get.
What achieves the ownership side of it?
Yeah.
So, there's a lot there to unpack. You're talking about the most traditional is just a referral partnership that we mentioned previously, right? Where you're just saying, hey, we'll partner with this company, we'll refer merchants, it'll be on their paper, their BIN, all of their customer service. Generally, they handle some version of sales. We get a portion of the revenue. And then, kind of a step up from that can be kind of a Payfac-as-a-Service. So basically, you're going to Payfac, you're going to white label their product. They're going to still handle the majority of it, but you are getting some version of a white labeling that occurs. And so that gets you, some branding with your customers. Usually the economics will be a little bit better in terms of, your agreement with that Payfac. They're still managing all the operational burden. Again, they kind of rely on you generally to manage the sales portion of it, but risk, underwriting, compliance, all that kind of stuff, they'll generally handle. You go with, actually registering as a Payfac, you're talking about a much more comprehensive technological burden. So you're talking about, having to do an integration, having a technological layer that allows you to manage, the boarding and the setup of the individual merchants.
The risk, the KYC.
You're absorbing that burden. You'll have the bank to backstop you to some degree. That process is generally a much longer process. Payfac-as-a-Service, you can be up and running in, 45, 60 to 75 days. But again, there are, you're a white labeled version of them. Again, the Payfac, you will still have a credit policy. If you're a traditional registered Payfac, you'll still have a credit policy with which you'll agree to, a common policy with whichever bank you choose to partner with. And again, the technological side of it becomes, I would say much more comprehensive. And so you have really, those are the three. And then when you jump into a traditional ISO sponsorship, you really have three options there too. So we're talking about several different circumstances. Again, as I mentioned, a lot to unpack, but you're in that situation, you have, a retail ISO. As I mentioned previously, it's kind of like a Payfac-as-a-Service. You register with a processor or an ISO. You actually do get some branding, so you'll have your name on the statements and things like that, but you're totally adhering to their credit policy. Risk compliance, operational burden is minimal, right? And again, you'll have economics are generally much better than a traditional referral partnership, but also limited in terms of who you can board, who you can work with, how you handle risk, and if there's challenges with merchants, it's generally going to be dictated to you what happens, right? Which is, for some may be good because they don't have to manage the risk and are fine with it, but it could cause you to lose important customers that maybe are just having, short-term challenges. When you talk about going into wholesale ISO, that's where it gets a little more comprehensive. You are assuming some level of risk and liability. You generally have an operational burden that is much more than a retail ISO or a Payfac-as-a-Service. And then, but you still are agreeing to a pretty black and white credit policy. And decisions at the reserve/risk level are generally made still by the processor that you partner with or the acquiring bank that you partner with. So then jumping into kind of the full FSP sponsorship, the full service provider, much more operational burden, technological burden, but you do, again, as we mentioned previously, you're getting your own dedicated BIN. You're getting, you can dictate pricing. You have much more latitude in terms of risk and reserves. You can generally give merchants a much more stable, and I would say, merchants that maybe have a little bit more in terms of hair on them from a processing perspective, you can give them, a bit more a stable environment because, again, you can give them more time to work through those challenges as opposed to, many of the others that we've discussed that are a lot more rigid in terms of what they'll allow you to do. So, I mean, that's again, pretty big spectrum. in the instance of, actually registering as a PayFac, you are, again, registering with a bank. It's a portfolio that you own, so there is certainly value there. And so it is pretty similar to like an FSP sponsorship. So really it comes down to setting priorities from the SaaS standpoint, right? What is it that they are looking for? Are they looking for a revenue stream and that's it? An additional revenue stream, monetizing their existing relationships, which that's what they're looking for. Or are you looking to actually, provide some operational support to earn more of the revenue share or earn more of the asset value as a business? So, that doesn't make one right or wrong. There's just a kind of a pretty decent spectrum of options relative to, how to set those up.
Right, that makes sense. So, Chris, given the various models that you just described, which would you say, in your personal and professional opinion, lends itself best to a strategy that ultimately maximizes enterprise value with maximum ownership and control? I guess let me ask it this way. If you were a software company today, knowing what you know about payments, the value that it can provide, the landscape, et cetera, where would you guide the strategy?
I mean, like you said, I'm probably a little bit biased given my experience with payments and, knowing all the individual nuances and challenges that are associated with the models, but also recognizing the value of, the individual options. For me, again, depending on the sophistication of the company we're talking about and their willingness to invest in this strategy, because again, this can be like little to no investment, maybe a basic integration, excuse me, or it can be a very significant integration, right? And obviously, just like you'd expect, the more integration that you go through, the more economic benefit you'll have. And so from my perspective, I mean, if you're really wanting to be a payments company, or at least optically, be a payments company, and own the book of business, own the merchant interaction, own how the merchants are handled, how they're, the terms that are dictated to them, really what you're talking about is an FSP sponsorship. I mean, you're really talking about, again, a very comprehensive strategy. And yes, it's going to have more operational expense to it. But again, you're going to participate in, again, top line revenue. So you're going to participate pre-interchange reduction. So the gross amount that you're billing merchants is going to flow through your P&L. And that net number, obviously is going to be less post-interchange. But I mean, again, that's going to increase your top line revenue significantly. And I think, from an asset value perspective, there are just so many other ways to monetize. As you add new products and services, you can just bolt them onto your existing services, things like that, where there's just so much more opportunity. And I think from my perspective, the value is significantly greater when you talk about, you actually own the bin, you own the customer relationship, you own the merchant contracts, all of those things. Okay.
So where would a software company get started today, Chris? If they decided that this was the path to maximizing value for their company, what advice would you give them? Where would they start? Obviously, as we look at the strategy, and something that we've talked about on previous podcasts is the idea that strategy is quite fluid. It's a path ultimately of evolution, right?
Sure.
No software company is going to come out of the gates and say they're going to do everything at the beginning.
Well, they like to say that.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make sense. It's not feasible, and the propensity of failure is very, very high. So, right, we always recommend that they take a very methodical and measured approach to their strategy, gain experience, prove concepts, and over time, gradually become more aggressive in your strategy to get the results that you're looking for.
For sure.
So as it pertains, as we talk about maybe a path to payment control and ownership over their customer portfolio, what does that look like? Where should they start?
Well, I mean, assuming that, the customer is looking for one of the, the strategy that I kind of just defined a minute ago, I mean, the first thing is alignment with the acquiring partner, right? You need a technological layer and you need alignment. So whatever your business model is from a software perspective, there are certain business types that have much more risk on them than others. And, you talk about the traditional processor of the world are very vanilla as far as what businesses they'll take. And so you really need to understand what risks you pose or your customers pose to any potential partner. So that's usually the first thing.
Someone that understands that a software company who really wants to maximize the value is going to go through a progression of sorts, right?
Yeah.
And you need a software or a processing partner that understands that.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, one of the things you mentioned, Brandon, I mean, I think, and it's interesting to me, you know, most software companies come to us and they say, hey, we want to do everything from out of the gate. We want to do risk, compliance, underwriting. We can do it all, right? We have people, we have experience, you know, we have revenue to be able to cover the OpEx, all those kinds of things. And, you know, having done this for a long time, you're talking about, you know, there are, you know, we've incurred significant losses from merchants due to mismanagement of, you know, risk profiles and things like that. We've, you know, compliance, there's just constant compliance from card brands, from banks, from processors that we have to deal with. And, you know, as someone, you know, we've been doing this for, you know, 15 years. We're still learning new things every day that we need to pay attention to. And it just added to the list, right? There's just so many things to pay attention to. So, you know, from my perspective, you know, most of these companies have a sales team, obviously, that they're employing to be able to sell their product. And for us, this is a pretty easy bolt-on, hey, you know, we can also do your payments. It's integrated. There's no double entry. It'll obviously flow back through, you know, our system, so you won't have to go in and, you know, plug in customer data or payment data or anything like that. It's all integrated, obviously, as I mentioned. And so they can just bolt that onto their existing sales structure. But again, from my perspective, you're talking about, if you really want to do this right, coming out of the gate and saying, we want to do this all, is just not a good strategy. Because even in the circumstances and the different options that I mentioned previously, you know, you're either leveraging others to do it exclusively out of the gate, or you are, you know, going full bore with it in a registered Payfac scenario. So from my perspective, the best thing that these companies can do is to really go more methodical about it, where they can say, hey, you know, we would like to take on pieces of this at a time. Find a more malleable structure with the different, you know, alternatives out there, options out there, where it's a bit more flexible, where you can learn those individual pieces of the, you know, the payment ecosystem while not having to suffer the expense of failure associated with, you know, ignorance. And so that's one of the challenges that these companies deal with. And frankly, like, you know, as a company, we've dealt with that. You know, when new regs come down, or, you know, PCI guidelines or things like that, they can be pretty onerous. And that's been a challenge for us over the years. And I start thinking about a company that hasn't done it, or, you know, doesn't have people with expertise relative to those specific circumstances. I mean, that can get really expensive, both operationally and potentially from a liability standpoint. So, right. You know, I guess from my perspective, really what we're talking about is know who you are, know who your customers are, align yourself with a payment company that can adapt and that can be more custom relative to what portions of those operational burdens do you want to absorb, right? And that's where I think our customers have enjoyed that flexibility, where it's saying, and we've even had people that say, hey, we want to do risk and compliance. And about 3 weeks in, they're like, just kidding. We don't want to do that anymore, right? Yeah. Because they start getting the list of, you know, requirements of things that they have to do, and they, no, we don't want to do that, right? And so, you know, from my perspective, the best strategy is just like anything. I mean, if you're going to jump into something new, a new business, new vertical, whatever it is, you generally don't go in, you know, both feet diving into the pool, or I guess both hands in that circumstance, but you want to kind of dip your toe in, make sure that you can support it, make sure that it aligns with your business model, but don't absorb liabilities or financial burdens you don't have to.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that, Chris, for sharing your perspective, and something that, you know, we share a lot here as a philosophy, because the idea is when we, you know, partner with a software company, we are their partner, right? That we should be just as invested in the success of their business as they are.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And we take pride in that. And so understanding and recognizing that software companies are going to grow, their strategies and visions for their business will evolve over time, and their payment strategy has to do that as well. And so, you know, if I were to leave any parting advice, it's find a payment processing partner that is ambitious and is invested in you, or ambitious as a business as well, and understands that things are going to change.
Yeah.
That they don't have restrictive or prohibitive contracts that are going to limit your ability to evolve your strategy over time and fully maximize the value of that, right?
Yeah, but also nimble. I mean, again, because as the ecosystem, as you mentioned, changes, you're still going to find that certain, you know, needs are going to change as well. And so, you know, finding someone that's nimble and that can adapt and that has that flexibility, as you mentioned, to be able to do that is, I think, pretty critical. Like I said, there are so many different ways to go about this, but I think in most of these SaaS companies, a payment option is something that's cohesive. It's not adding some product or service that doesn't make sense most of the time. And so it's something that aligns with their business model, and it's a relatively, while payments, at least from my perspective, is pretty complex and difficult, when you're partnering with someone that knows and understands that, and you're leveraging their expertise, it can be a fairly simple bolt-on and can result in pretty significant, not only, as we've discussed, asset value, but just, top-line revenue contribution.
Okay. Well, Chris, I want to thank you for being on today. This has been super insightful. As we know, this is not an easy task. Software companies have a lot of different options out there in the marketplace and are trying to figure out what works best for them. And so we advise any of those that are listening today, they can connect with us. They can visit us at next.io, connect with our team here. We specialize in helping software companies think very strategically about integrated payments and what they can do to maximize the value. So, Chris, we hope to have you on soon. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.